It's all one big happy Jewish thing. Speaking of big happy Jewish things, you are here with CSP, the Community Scholar Program, and more of you. I'm pleased to see there are 72. There are 72 letters in the largest name of God, right? You know what the largest name of God is, right? It has 72 letters in it. Can I show it to you? I might have it here. I don't know. Maybe not. Okay, it has 72 letters in it. Some people say there are 72 names of God. So now there's 75, which kind of ruined the whole thing. Thank you, last two participants, for destroying our divine name. Here we are at CSP, where programming continues infinitely in all time, in all space. It's like Jasper Goldhart's icon there with this clock that keeps going. There's programming every second of every day. In fact, starting next week on Thursdays, I'm going to be hosting, although not, thank God, giving, because I wouldn't know what to do, a noon program, noon Pacific time, 12:30 Pacific time, 3:30 East Coast time, with Chaim Seidlerfelder, who's an excellent speaker on Zionism and Jewish sovereignty, and a variety of topics that are hot and controversial. Very interesting speaker, and a real mensch. So you should not miss that. We are, of course, currently, I wouldn't say, you could say enjoying perhaps, a series that I'm doing called Artifacts of Identity, Exploring Jewish Material Culture Through Time. And we have done everything from where is the lost ark? Is it in Ethiopia? To what did the temple look like and what pieces still remain from the temple, to a session last time before Passover on clothes, making the person, Jewish clothing, what's unique, what's particular about it. And today, I'm going to talk about a little bit about Jewish homes and about the problems about thinking about Jewish homes historically. I just want to thank those of you who've written me after the sessions. Ari always gives some follow up, but for instance, Ahuva wrote me an email last time in which she discussed, debated, disputed, and supplemented a number of points that I made. She knows that although I would love to talk about all these topics for 8 hours, in 1 hour you can't do everything. So likewise today, I can't possibly survey the whole topic, but I want to bring up some of the problems in reconstructing material culture. And sadly, May 14th will be our last session, which is called Erased Synagogues. And that is going to be about synagogues that were and are no longer, with a sort of bow to the idea of the once and future synagogue, because there are many places in which synagogues have been revived and reconstituted. So you'd have a synagogue in a place that was either neglected or purposefully destroyed, maybe purposefully turned into something else when Jews were expelled, or when there were movements against Jews. And then in more recent history, synagogues being restored, sometimes to uses that are not Jewish, but increasingly to uses that are Jewish. So synagogues are interesting to think with, and we sort of go back to all the themes when we discuss synagogues. But today, the question of being at home in the Jewish world, and a question of what a Jewish house looks like. This is a Jewish house. I know it's a Jewish house because it's in England, in Lincoln. And it is called, if you can see on this chimney piece here, it's called Jew's House, right? It's the oldest house, or one of the oldest houses in Lincoln. It dates till probably the time of the First Crusade. And it was the home of Jews who lived in the city. You can see even in the old postcards that it is a substantial stone house. It has been modified somewhat in the 19th century from its ancient Gothic character, which you can see more clearly in this old sketch, right? Pointy windows, et cetera, et cetera. And in fact, you can see all the transformations it's gone through. That is, this window remains of Gothic, these portal with its pointy keyhole sort of arch here. These windows are Romanesque. You see the rounded arches. These are 19th century. And this window, interestingly, maybe it had a window frame on top of it as the door, and these arches is a very substantial sort of window that probably was one of 3 windows that let light into the central room. And what happened in this house? Well, Jews lived upstairs before the expulsion from Spain, and downstairs they did their business. This was the room in which they did their business, which was, of course, in the case of the Jews of Lincoln, money lending. We know a good deal about the Jews of Lincoln. They were, we have names, including of a woman who might have lived in this house. Her name was Licoricia, I love that, who was part of this family. She was quite a prominent person in Lincoln in England. And the reason we know about this house and its pedigree is because there are official records in the archives called plea rolls, which talk about tallages and encumbrances and all kinds of financial records of the Jews vis-a-vis the Gentile population of the town. So that house has remained, and it has the reputation of being the Jews' house. And what is interesting and remarkable about it is that it's not remarkable. It's remarkable for its size. In the Middle Ages, this would have been a huge house, right? But it's not remarkable in that it has no distinguishing Jewish features. Funny, you don't look Jewish. There's no niche for a mezuzah in the front door. There's no sign of its previous usage, right? And like clothing being a function very often of the particular society in which Jews lived, and a reflection less of sort of internal Jewishness than of, shall we say, a reflection of what the outside society was doing. The main characteristic of Jewish homes is they looked like the homes in which anybody else lived. From the earliest time, here's a quote unquote typical Jewish house in the Talmudic period in Babylonia or the land of Israel, right? Essentially a one-story building, multi-use, right? Storage areas, kitchen area, animal area, outside ovens, interior courtyard where animals might be kept, and then a loft for sleeping, beds, storerooms, an oven, a chimney, another kitchen, another outside oven. This is based on what we found excavating buildings of the Talmudic period, 2nd through 4th century, a little bit earlier in some places. The Harvard, what used to be called Semitic Museum, has a reconstruction including sheep, which is very, very cute, right? And Jewish dwellings obviously range from what you see here, this very simple and yet multifunctional and pretty comprehensively elaborate, in the sense that it has everything you could possibly need, dwelling in either ancient Israel or in Babylonia, to literally the estates of Jews in the 19th century. I'll show you a few here. This is the Lieberman Villa in Wannsee in Germany, right? Beautiful little building, not notable. You see the next door villa, right? So it's not notable for its hugeness, right? But in England, an efflorescence, because Jews were sometimes ennobled in the 19th century. This is the Solomon's country estate in Kent, right? And you can see the massiveness of the building, or the various homes of the Rothschilds, like Waddesdon Manor, right? Some rooms from Waddesdon Manor, the exterior of Waddesdon Manor at dusk, not bad, right? And certainly sort of evolutionarily a far cry from first, 2nd century Jewish dwellings, right? The drawing room, Waddesdon Manor, dining room, Waddesdon Manor, the gray drawing room at Waddesdon Manor. Lest you think it's Rothschilds all the way down. It is, but here's Benjamin Disraeli's home. Benjamin Disraeli, of course, was Prime Minister of England. His father left the Spanish Portuguese synagogue in London after he'd been honored by being made Parnasse. Parnasse is the president, basically. But to be Parnasse, you had to contribute a certain number of pounds a year, which Disraeli's father considered extravagant. So he left, took everybody out, raised them in the Church of England, and Disraeli, of course, becomes Queen Victoria's prime minister. And the Rothschilds themselves were famous for their garden parties and their summer parties, weekend parties. And if you look at this image of various Rothschilds and guests, you can see the Prince of Wales, right, who is, becomes the King of England, as a guest of the Rothschilds. All right. So a number of years ago, I got a call from somebody at the University of Zurich, and they said, you have to come down and come to Zurich. I'm like, why would I go to the most boring city in the universe? With all due respect to any native Zurichers here, I'd been like a couple of times, either passing through the airport or actually, doomed to spend time at the university where the people are great and the program is terrific. But it's in Zurich. Had I had a chance to spend my time at Waddesdon Manor, I would have preferred that. And I was like, okay, I can come. Is there a conference? They said, no, we want you to look at a Citibank branch. Okay, Citibank branch, an undistinguished building, except that it wasn't, it's an 18th century building in the middle of this street that Citibank, I believe, had bought and was going to turn into a bank branch, as they have done to almost every venue on the Upper West Side of New York, right, Mom? Right, you go in, you thought it was a charming restaurant, you show up there, it's an ATM, right? And this was happening in Zurich. You can see it's next to a fruitier, and the building itself has a shoe store on the bottom level. It's in Brunnergasse. And what's important about this building is that we happen to know that around 1330, a Jewish family lived in this house in Zurich's Old Town. There was a woman who was called Minne, as in Minnie Mouse, right? But Minne will become significant in a second. And she had two sons. The father apparently was dead, Moshe and Mordechai, who were called Moshe ben Menachem and Mordechai ben Menashe. And they lived in this house, and nobody really thought much about it until they decided that they wanted to gut the interior to turn it into a bank branch, as one does in Zurich, the city of banks, or one of the city of banks. And what they discovered in the hall, the stairway hall, entry hall, was a bunch of murals underneath the plaster, which they were very concerned and interested in because they seemed to be from the 1300s and colorful, very colorful. I tried to get as best photos as I could, and I'll show you some of the details in a second. This is a professional photo. It's better. What you see in this photo are 3 panels that ran all the way around this sort of second floor room. So you come into the building, the bottom floor was storage and entry, and you'd walk up the staircase and you'd come into a large room that was surrounded on all 4 sides with painting. And what's interesting about it is that it's very figurative, and it looks very much like art of its time and place. It's unusual to find any domestic decorated art from the Middle Ages because times change, decorating tastes change, things are painted over, they disappear. If you walk into my home in Poughkeepsie, New York, you'll see that the entrance hall is painted bright white. And then you walk into my apartment, through a door in a wall that wasn't there when the house was built in 1902. And you see that there are murals in gold and red from 1902 on the walls and the ceilings, including poetry about friendship and, and you realize that you're in my apartment and those murals are painted on the walls. And then there's this fake wall that they added to divide the building and a door. And if that wall were down, the entire hall would have been part of my living room, including stained glass windows and a magnificent wooden staircase that goes up and curls around, right? And what I note is that on those white walls in the outer hall, if you scrape them a little, there's red paint underneath. So that means that the whole hall was originally painted like the interior of my entry to my apartment. But over the years, tastes change and functions change. Somebody in 50, subdividing this mansion for use of professors, said, "Oh, we can't have these murals in the hall; it's too dark," and they painted it white. Right? It wasn't malicious intent. Also, the style was very old. Right? It was already from 1902. So you can imagine somebody coming into a medieval home and whitewashing the walls and painting them, et cetera, et cetera. It's more complicated with Jews, of course, because if there is a pogrom, and pogrom is really an East European term of the late 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries. If we talk about Western Europe or Switzerland, we would just say, anti-Jewish riots or manifestations, violence against Jews. If there's violence against Jews in a place and Jews are expelled or Jewish property is confiscated, very often it's covered over because it was Jewish. Imagine you want to turn a synagogue into a granary or a beer hall or a storage facility for rope. These are all things that happen to synagogues, as we'll see next time. You want to paint it so it's no longer a Jewish liturgical space. What happened here at Brunnenstrasse in Zurich is not that. This was a Jewish space, and I'll show you why in a second, but it was painted over because the function of the building changed, right? And the style changed. And so in consonance with this 18th century exterior, the door, sort of neoclassical, right? This stuff looked really old, really drecky, right? And so it was painted over. Now, we know that this large room was a Jewish room for only one reason, because the decorations themselves are quite courtly. There's a man here with a short tunic, meaning a servant or musician playing an oboe. There are images, I'll show you more of that in a second, of a man on a horseback with a bow in his hand. You can see it barely here, right? Really bad condition because it was underneath the plaster. There's a man and a woman dancing. She's holding her hand out to him, I think very beautifully dancing. Here's a detail of the man on horseback. He has a hawk on his glove, and a detail of the woman and her hand reaching out for the man's hand. So it looks in a way like a dance hall, like a place where social functions would occur. And you ask yourself, so why would the pious widow Frau Minne and her sons, the sons of Menachem, that's Moshe ben Menachem and Mordechai ben Menachem, be running a dance hall? It's true that Jews ran taverns, right? Particularly in East Europe later. But we know that the Jews that lived in Zurich made their living primarily as moneylenders. And so the conjecture is that this room was used for that purpose. And the way we know it's a Jewish room is that if you look very carefully, there's a band of armorial shields, of noble houses. There was, by the way, before there were whitewashed walls, the top layer, I should say, is whitewashed walls. Beneath it is something called sgraffito, which is this, you paint everything black, then you paint white on top of it, and then you carve into the white and the black shows up. right? And beneath that, what you see here are the oldest level of the murals of the dancing couples, of the hawking and noble pursuits. And these are memorials all over the room. You can see here, can't see much that's left from the rest of the murals, but you see the shields. The shields appear over and over again, and they are really what our clue to the usage of the room is, because underneath the shields are written in what we call Rashi script, right, or Weiber Schrift, a particular kind of chicken scratchy medieval handwritten hand, right, not in the block square letters that you used to from Hebrew school or from reading liturgical Hebrew in the prayer book, et cetera, but in this script are written names. And each of these names corresponds somehow to the shield. We will get back to that as we continue, but I want to emphasize for you the difference between this elegant, courtly milieu of the Middle Ages that we see in real life and the similarities, and some of the contexts in which we view Jews through other media. So if it's the case that Jewish homes were destroyed or repurposed, and we don't have many homes that we can certify were, in previous times, Jewish homes, how do we know what the interiors of Jewish homes in previous times looked like without physical evidence? Well, in the case of the ancient homes, right, we read accounts in texts. And if you read the book of Samuel, the book of Kings, right, there's descriptions. It says, he came into the outer courtyard, or, he went up to the aliyah. The aliyah is the loft where people slept, right? Or they're among the jars, right? So there's an area for storage. So we can reconstruct on the basis of floor remaining, floor profiles, and on the basis of textual evidence, what was in an ancient house. And it's pretty, it says somebody goes to goes to tend the animals, and the animals are in the home. We understand that the animals live with people in the home to a on a small scale. If you had a large farm, of course, you had a refet or a cow barn or a sheep barn, right? So that's how we know it for buildings in that period. In the Middle Ages, we also have some how could you put it, literary evidence, because for instance, in Masechet Shabbat, there's a discussion of what one may do or may not do on Shabbat. And one of the concepts that is brought up is something called make bepatish. Make bepatish means one hits with a hammer. That is, let's imagine that you're putting together IKEA furniture, right? And you put together all these pasteboard, bookcases or whatever it is, a table. And then you screw with your Allen wrench. Oh God, I'm so glad those days are behind me. But you screw with your Allen wrench, the little screw in the hole, and then they give you a little plug that's made of, interestingly, it's made of real wood, okay? And it's meant to cover that little screw that went in the hole. So you take the plug made of real wood and you put it in the hole and you tap it with a hammer, right? Now, is it necessary to do that? Right? I'm looking at this bookshelf. I have them here, right? Is it necessary to do that? No, but it adds a sort of finishedness to the product, to the piece of furniture, right? And so the question becomes, can one on Shabbat, when we know that we are not allowed to construct the furniture, can one just take a hammer and tap it to complete it, to do something that completes it, right? And the answer is no. That's one of the prohibited activities on Shabbat, which is the idea of completing something with a tap of the hammer. So Rashi the great medieval French commentator who lives around the time that this building is built, in Masechet Shabbat, in the tractate on Shabbat of the Talmud, makes the following comments. He describes Makeh B'Patish. One of the activities would be, let's say, he says, you have murals on the wall, like of David and Goliath. Interesting, right? And he says, and you want to write beneath it with a brush, underneath the figure of David with his slingshot, Zed David, this is David, and underneath the figure of the giant Goliath falling backwards with the stone in his head, right? Zed Goliath. He says, we can't do that. But in saying that, and this is why it's fun sometimes to be an historian, in saying that, he allows us to glimpse a world in which Jews had paintings on their walls. So besides a physical space like this, which is so passing rare that I had to get on a plane to Zurich to see it when it was first uncovered, there are literary evidences for early ancient homes, and there are literary evidences like that Rashi comment for medieval homes. And in addition to that, there are illustrations in books and, oh my goodness, oh, sorry. There are illustrations in books and manuscripts. Let me just make sure that everything is off here. Yes, okay. And so, hold on. Yes. And so we have these magnificent Haggadot that are illuminated in the Middle Ages and in the early modern period up through the 18th and 19th century, what I study. And we there get a glimpse of the interiors of homes. We're looking at art commissioned by Jews, sometimes from other Jews, as in this case, and sometimes from non-Jews, in which Jews are trying to depict how their lives looked. So in this particularly lovely example from Cincinnati, now in the Clow Library of the Hebrew Union College in that city, we have the Falk family at their Seder table. And this was illuminated by a Jewish artist, Moshe Leib, the son of Wolf of Trebich, right? So it was made in Moravia, probably around 70, and it was made in 1717. We know that it's dated. And here's a table, right, which we see elaborately dressed. Also elaborately dressed are the participants. Let's read the image from the left to the right. Here, there is a servant in gray who is holding up a pitcher and pouring something into a cup. Here, there is the head of household dressed in white in a kittel and in a hat that goes with the kittel. Here, there are two young children, a boy and a girl. Here, there are adult sons, right, in three-cornered hats. Here, there are two little girls. And here is the woman of the house dressed in her finery. She's wearing a white dress with a red overcoat, a red surcoat. Her hair is covered. And the pater familias, the head of household, right, the male head of household, is holding a wine cup. The two adult sons are holding wine cups. The mater familias is holding a wine cup, which is interesting. And the kids don't have wine cups. And on the table, there is a pillow. And on the pillow, there is a red cloth. And on the red cloth, there are the various accoutrements of the Seder. You have to understand that there was no such thing as a Seder plate until sometime in the 19th century. The Israel Museum holds a Seder plate allegedly from pre-expulsion Spain. That is a very questionable object. And the idea of the Seder plate came in very late, and you can see that from the Haggadot. A few other details. If you notice, this scene is being held in a room that's very open. There are two windows here, both one flung open, one closed. There's a door that's opened, and we look out into a garden with a fountain, right? And on the outside, there are trees. In the open window, there's a bird in a cage and a woman walking by the window. In the closed window, there's just trees. Hanging from the ceiling, there's a Judenstern, which is a Sabbath lamp or a holiday lamp, multi-branched, used for light and also for the blessing. And two other distinctive features, or three. There are these tassels hanging down, which lead me to believe that there is a skylight above this scene, and the tassels would raise or lower the shades on the skylight, or perhaps open the skylight. That's why there are tassels hanging down from the ceiling. There are also, that's hard to see here. There are also mirrors, candlesticks with mirrors. There are no, there are lights in the lamp, but there are no candles in the candlesticks. There's a dog under the table, a kind of rat-like looking dog. And framed above the door is a painting of Elijah the prophet being fed by ravens, right, from the Book of Kings. And the whole thing is seen through yet another window. You see how this frame has an angel at the top, right? Well, there's another frame in which we're looking, through which we're looking at the scene. And what's interesting about this scene is it's highly detailed, and yet at the same time, it's highly elaborate. It's very, I would say, there's symbolic elements. We could talk about them. So, for instance, the dog under the table is not simply a dog, but a reference to the Israelites who leave Egypt, where a dog did not lash its tongue out at the Israelites because God protects them. You have the ravens feeding Elijah, divine providence. The table with the open door, right, saying kol dichvin, everyone who wants to eat, come in and eat. The idea of caged bird and the free birds, which you can see flying in the sky, right? So enslavement and freedom, the servants and the free people, right? The role of the woman with the Kiddush cup, and then finally the framing device, which means that we're looking at something which is almost a performance. And Bernard Berenson famously said that art is based not on actuality, but on the wishes, dreams, and aspirations of a people. And I would argue that when we see home interiors in these old books, what we are seeing is not a photographic record of the way we were, but rather a manifestation of the desire to present oneself in a certain way, right? So Passover is an interesting time. Passover is a time when, I don't know if you know this, but the halacha is, the Jewish law is, that one must take out one's best and most elaborate accoutrement, housewares, to display at the Seder, right? Why would that be? Well, long ago, right, when Abram was still Abram, and God promises him a fate for him and his descendants. Abram is skeptical. It's like, I'm so old, how am I going to have a kid, right? God says, not only will you have one kid, you'll have lots of kids. Oi, says Abram, how many kids? God says, go outside. Goes outside. God says, okay, count the stars. How many are there? Abram says, I don't know, there's more than I can count. So, says God, will be your descendants. Abram's like, wow, that's pretty impressive. God says, but know that your descendants will be enslaved to a people who are not from their in group, and they'll be there for 400 years. And yet afterwards, I will intervene and take them out of their Birchush Gadol with great property. So this promise, which we celebrate in the Seder in a passage in the Haggadah called Vehi She'amda, right? This promise is the Vehi, she, it, in other words. This promise has stood for our ancestors and for us, even though not only one, but many have risen up against us to destroy us, yet God has saved us from their hand, right? So every part of that prophecy, so to speak, that promise to Abraham is enacted in the book of Exodus. And in the book of Exodus, of course, the Israelites are enslaved. They're enslaved for a shorter period than God initially promises, because God hears their cry of suffering. And before they go out, they are asked, they are told in Parshas Bo to go out and ask every one of his neighbor and every woman of her friend, right, vessels of gold and silver. Can you imagine? Right? You need to borrow a cup of sugar. Maybe you can go down the hall and talk to your neighbor, right? Unless they're, absentee landlords who are managing the apartment, from China, right? You might be able to talk to your neighbor and get a cup of sugar, right? Or, right, you could say, I need to borrow a Tupperware. But the Israelites went around and said, we need to borrow some stuff because we're going on a journey. The Egyptians were like, oh, yeah, really? What do you need? And the Israelites were, we need vessels of silver and gold. And the Egyptians gave them, and they went out. And that, according to the logic of scripture, is how they had all the gold and silver that they needed to build the tabernacle in the wilderness, right? So Vishalu, they borrowed vessels of gold and silver, and they were given them. It was crucial that they be given them and that they not loot the Egyptians. Although the text in Exodus says, they looted the Egyptians, right? So that's called the Egyptian loot or the Egyptian booty. And as a result of that, in memory of that, halacha enjoins that you're supposed to take your best stuff and display it on the Seder table or display it on a sideboard, right? And that is the origin or the parallel of the idea that in the Haggadah, when Jews depicted themselves, they did so in a lavish and over-the-top way that reflected their wishes, dreams, and aspirations. Well, you might say, image and text thus are in relationship because the Haggadah says, in each and every generation, one must view oneself as if one had personally come out of Egypt. And Maimonides famously on that passage says, not view oneself, liros es atzmo, but display oneself, leharos es atzmo, to display oneself as if one had personally come out of Egypt. How does one do that? Vessels of gold and silver. Attitude, right? We have the attitude of free people. We recline at certain points in the Seder, right? So that display is very important. So this image is part of that nexus of display and self-presentation, of self-demonstration, let's say. But here's the question. What about history and so-called details of everyday life, right? Are they inevitably bound up with the image, right? What do we say when we see an image like this, right? So art can be a mirror of everyday life, or even of special festival life in the case of the Haggadah, and of the world outside the page in general, but it can sometimes be a mirror, but it is always a projector. And this is very, very crucial. I had an ongoing argument with the late Vivian Mann, who was the curator for many years of Judaic at New York's Jewish Museum. And she said that the patrons of art, of medieval manuscripts, must have owned objects like we see in the art, right? That is hand washing implements, double cups, particular kinds of table linens, right? Because we see them in the pictures. And secondly, archaeologists had found similar objects in various excavations. So if I have a manuscript that shows me with a certain kind of hand washing vessel, that vessel is kind of a portrait of what I have in my life, right? At the right, by the way, we're looking at this image from a very strange manuscript called the Griffin's Head Haggadah, which is something that I have worked on extensively. And at the left, it's the Oxford pot. This is a pot that was found buried in England. It has cow's feet on the bottom. It's a copper vessel. It has a Hebrew inscription. It seems to have been, and it has a fleur-de-lis because the Jews were associated with the king, whose symbol in England at that time was a fleur-de-lis. And it seems to have been used for either preparing communal meals for the poor or as a charity coin repository. It's still the jury is still out on that question. And we have found a number of what are called hoards, treasure hoards, Hordes, primarily in Germany, places that are in the German realms now. This is the Erfurt treasure hoard, and what it consists of are a number of gold and gilded pieces, nothing's pure, silver, I should say, and gilded pieces, nothing's pure gold, that were found buried underground in a neighborhood determined in Erfurt, there's one in Cologne, to have been a Jewish area. What happened was that in 1348, when the first Black Death plagues broke out, there were violent manifestations against the Jews. Again, don't call them pogroms in this period and place. So violent manifestations against the Jews, and the Jews had to flee. And what they did was they buried everything they had that was valuable underneath the ground with the intention of coming back to it at a certain point, which they never did. Not only do we have in these hoards things that Jews actually use themselves. I mean, there's a set of cups here that people say, oh, they must be Kiddush cups, but they look exactly like cups that non-Jews used as well. Salt cellars, numbers of coins. We have found Jewish wedding rings. So the community would own a wedding ring that would be used symbolically, a large ring with a house on top that was used symbolically in marriage ceremonies. And very interestingly, jewelry for women and sometimes for children, including a brooch that has a really beautiful depiction of Aesop's fables of the fox with the grapes, right? So among the many other things that had been found in this Erfurt hoard was a double cup, okay? So here's the double cup. Let me show you a little bit closer here. Right, here's the double cup. It has a nice enamel. It was kind of crushed. It's hard to know, hard to see that it was a double cup, but you can see this hinge on the sides. If it had been in good shape, it would have been pretty much identical in morphology and shape to the so-called cloisters cup, the famous double cup from the cloisters in Manhattan. You can go up and see it anytime if you're in New York. If you're in LA, you have to come to New York, right? Which is really interesting. It's engraved with the names of the three magi, the three kings who come to visit Jesus: Gaspar, Melchior, Balthazar. And at the very top, it has a shield, and shields will be important to us in a second, with three Jewish hats. Three Jewish hats. So is it a Christian object because it has the names of the kings? Is it a Jewish object? Is it an object that was in the process of being transformed from one to the other? We really don't know. It's fascinating. But Vivian Mann claimed that this double cup, so you can see, right? Here's the hinge on the side. In the complete example, you can see it here, right? You can see how it had a sort of foot, right? That since double cups are found in this hoard, what we see in the Griffin's Head Haggadah must be one of these double cups. Now, I think it's probably pretty obvious, or at least it was obvious to my kids who looked at this, that what we're looking at here is not a double cup. It is a tankard, right? That's why it's red. It's full of wine. This is probably a glass vessel or a metal vessel of some kind. It has an open top and it has a foot. So, she misidentified this as a double cup. So that's the first problem. The second problem is this image, where you have what appears very much to be a double cup, right? Except at the same time, we have to look at the context of the illustration. First of all, the image shows a figure examining his nails by what? The light of a lantern. This is a lantern with a chimney on the top. The caption reads, Boreh me'oreh ha'esh, right? God, creator of the flames of fire, right? And this is the blessing of Havdalah on a Saturday night. And this figure appears next to that blessing. So he's holding a lantern, hence the yellow color. And this is also not a double cup. So it seems like we're looking at double cups, but we're not actually looking at double cups. In fact, in all the scenes of vessels, there are no double cups. So you know, you can think about why people are displaying themselves in a particular way in a manuscript. Here, you could take Vivian's approach, which was that the patrons are depicting themselves as owning particular accoutrement, versus my idea that the patrons are depicting themselves as the kind of people who would own such accoutrement. Now, this may seem like a semantic and silly distinction, right? How could she contend that particular patrons about which nothing is known definitely own particular objects just because we see pictures of similar objects, or maybe not similar, as in the case of the double cup, in manuscripts they commission? On the other hand, arguing against myself, how could I prove that they did not own such objects? And moreover, why was it not particularly important whether they actually did or not, but rather that they wanted to display themselves as being the kinds of people who did own such objects and who had such homes, right? All I can say is that we don't have depictions of Jewish homes in the Middle Ages, but in manuscripts, we have people who want to display themselves as having particular kind of homes, right? Is a manuscript a mirror? Or, right? Or is it a projector? That's the question. And I would argue that everything we see in a manuscript is a projection of things patrons wanted to say about themselves and project to viewers. Even though it looks like a representation, it is also an aspiration. Right? And so when we see these lavish homes depicted lavishly in these manuscripts, we have to also stop and think. This is not intended to be a photographic record. It, in fact, given the status, for instance, of 18th century Jews working for the royal court, as these Jews did, it's almost a reflection of their state of mind. Right? These were very wealthy Jews, and the times in which they lived were still very dark times. You could be a court Jew, and it was great when things were stable in the regime. So here's Shmuel Oppenheimer. He was a court Jew under and military supplier for the Holy Roman Emperor Leopold I, and he was granted many rights and privileges. He was allowed to live in Vienna, where Jews had been expelled previously. He had a minion that could live with him. He built a mansion in the center of town. And in 1700, when an anti-Jewish violent riot broke out and the community's houses were sacked and looted by a Christian mob, the emperor ordered a Christian hanged for sacking Oppenheimer's house and others imprisoned for participating in the disturbance. This was highly unusual. He was a guy who had every possible privilege, right? Which is what these people are trying to depict themselves as being. But he had a nephew who was also a court Jew. And his name was he was called Yud Zus Oppenheimer, Joseph Zus Oppenheimer. He also worked for a local monarch. And when his protector died in 1737, his enemies seized him, arrested him, accused him of treason and embezzlement. He was tortured. He broke down. He confessed to every outrageous and scurrilous accusation that was leveled against him, but he refused to convert to Christianity. So he was tortured for a year, and he was hanged a year later with the words of the Shema on his lips, and his corpse was displayed in a public square in Stuttgart for 6 years, so that the next court Jew walking to work had to walk under his corpse. So when we see an image like this, full of lavishness, ostentatiousness, over-the-top fancy dress drama with all the stops pulled out, and we see this house, it's quite possible that a Jewish house in this time and place, owned by court Jews, looked like this. right? We do have the evidence, after all, if you remember, from the very beginning of the talk, of the very lavish homes of the Rothschilds and the Disraelis and others like that, right? But this image conceals beneath it, not so subtly, an essential anxiety and a sort of wish or prayer or hope or aspiration that this state of perfect lavishness and protection should last forever and never be taken away from us court Jews. There's anxiety underneath this image. Likewise, our house in what's called now Schauplatz, Brungasse in Zurich displays a similar kind of anxiety. This is a Jewish home. There was a first floor, as I say, there was storage, etc. You walked up into this kind of ballroom that was decorated with all these images, including, we think here, this image of a woman dancing with a man, and the woman is Frau Minne. Minne in German and German culture is sort of Venus, is the goddess of love, the goddess of spring, the goddess of love, you know, Botticelli's Primavera. It was also the name of the Jewish widow who ran the place. So that image evoked her name. By the way, Minnie Mouse, you know, Mickey Mouse and Minnie Mouse. Minnie Mouse is not a small mouse, right? And the name, sometimes you might have had an Aunt Minnie, right? Doesn't mean small, doesn't mean compact. It's Minnie, it means love. The Hebrew equivalent would be Ahuva. Hi, Ahuva, right? Right? So Minnie, so she's depicted, this woman, this widow, is in the middle of all the frescoes, and on the walls above her are these shields. And next to the shields are these inscriptions. And what these inscriptions say, which I didn't tell you initially, what's written under the shields are the names of the various noble families of non-Jews, of knights, Ritter knights, in Zurich at this time. And what this was a place where Jews did their business, money lending. Money lending was a dangerous business. You took a person's property, you held it, you lent them money at interest. If the person wanted their money back, they, as knights, as nobles, had basically the possibility of coming in, destroying your space, taking back their pledge, as it was called, and just taking all your money and maybe killing you, right? If they didn't like your terms or they decided they didn't want to pay back. There was a grotesque power differential. Jews grew wealthy, some of them in lending money, but like those Jews who were court Jews in the 18th century, their lives were very precarious. You know, we say, well, Jews were moneylenders. Some of them were physicians. How is it to be a Jewish physician in the Middle Ages, in the Renaissance? Jews are expelled from England in the 1300s, right? Some of them remain. They're called Portuguese. By the time of Queen Elizabeth, there still are Jews in England. Some of them are musicians. They've taken Christian names. Some of them are physicians. Queen Elizabeth's court physician is a guy named Roberto Lopez. Roberto Lopez is a lucky guy. He is the physician to the Queen. But when the Queen becomes ill, they accuse him of trying to poison him, and they hang him. And they don't hang him as a Portuguese Christian, they hang him as a Jew. So if you lived in this place, you would decorate your Jewish home in a way in which a Christian could feel comfortable. And on the wall, you would have not your own coat of arms because you didn't have one. You were the property of the crown as a medieval Jew. You would have all the coats of arms of the nobles inscribed in Hebrew letters, in Yiddish phonetics, with the name of the ennobled family. So you could remember them and say, ah, nice to see you, Mr. Oliphant, Mr. Elfenbein, right? That's the name under the famous elephant, which became the symbol of this house when Zurich turned it into a museum as it had, right? And so those symbols remain there as kind of a tale, a cautionary tale, although the bottom mural looks like it's full of joy and love and light and all of that and mutuality. Those shields remind us that the patron is a Christian, he is a knight, he is a nobleman, and you are nothing but a Jew who has to remember his name and be nice to him when he comes into your house and into your space. So Jewish homes in earlier times, whether the sort of most ancient and functional stratum, right, or the most elaborate, ennobled of homes, but more generally, homes which, like the Jew's house, the home of Lycorissia, as I said, on the one floor was residential, the top floor, the bottom floor was for doing business. Very often, the Jewish home in history has been a place in which business was done, Jews and Christians met, and it was a place of only relative security. And that's something we should keep in mind when we think of Jewish history in pre-modern times. Next time, synagogues, liturgical spaces. But for now, I am going to entertain some questions. I'm going to look at the meeting chat and see what is mentioned here. I know nothing about the Lincoln House, Rita and Bob. I wish I did. Bernard Kabak says, yes, Geneva is worse than Zurich. It outbores Zurich. That is true. Zurich at least has a restaurant, the oldest vegetarian restaurant in Europe. It's called Hittel, meaning little hat. And it's a wonderful vegetarian restaurant. I've been there. Yes, Mary and John, the instrument being played here is the hautbois, Hautbois, right? We call it the oboe today. It has a sort of, it's also called the ney, N-E-Y, in Indian music. It has a sort of bulb here. Bernard tells us that his family might be tavern keepers, right? We don't need archaeological evidence of Jewish taverns. The Jewish tavern keeper is a topos in literature, both in Russian literature, Hungarian literature, all Central and Eastern European literature. The krechma, the Jewish inn that served alcohol, you often attached to the home. So there's an inn, and the innkeeper lived upstairs, et cetera, was part of this this culture, right? Margot says that in our image, it appears to be still daytime. So that's also very interesting. You need to have a Seder after sunset, right? So why does it appear to be daytime? I have a theory about that. The Passover sacrifice happened at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, right? So this may also be referring to the antiquity, the ancient time of a Passover sacrifice. This room was no doubt the room, Rena, that was also served as the sukkah for these people in the fall time, right? I don't see a grandmother covering her eyes with her hands. Faith, maybe I'm wrong, but I see no such person here. Right. Very good. David, why are the noses beaks? Because they're griffins. This is a Haggadah in which all the Jewish characters are depicted as lion, eagle, human hybrids, and all of the non-Jewish characters have blank faces. If you're interested in that, you can read my book called Skies of Parchment, Seas of Ink, medieval Jewish illuminated manuscripts. Yes, Rita and Bob, the ney is an Arabic flute, but it also what I meant is it also has a bulb attached to it. Okay. No, Ellen, the shields do not depict the 12 tribes. There is no elephant among the 12 tribes. There are many more than 12 of them, and they depict, they have the names of noble families beneath them. So it's a pleasure to see you all. I'm really, really excited, although somewhat sad, about closing out the series next time. I will remind you that the last session is May 14th, and it's called Erased Synagogues. Look forward to seeing you on Thursday, May 14th. You are the best. Thank you for your kind words. And hopefully next time Ari will be here to lighten the atmosphere with clever banter, which we always like. So if you miss that, you will have it next time. It's been a real pleasure, and we will see you on May the 14th. Take care. Bye-bye.